Today on The Growing Philosopher. Today we will conclude our discussion on philosophy proper. We will look at some of the main reasons why Christians should study philosophy. And finally, Patrick and Michael will give you a list of their top 10 philosophers that they recommend that you read if you're just starting to explore the world of philosophical ideas. Here on The Growing Philosopher. Well, our last main question, and then we'll have a lightning round question afterwards. Is the history of philosophy relevant to Christians? Should they study the history of philosophy? Mike and I have been recording a mini-series on Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and he opens up the book with an illustration of a post-apocalyptic world where everything has been destroyed. All science, all philosophy, every form of knowledge and institution has been reduced to ashes, or at least fragments. And so in this post-apocalyptic world, everybody's scraping by, trying to get the pieces and the fragments of what was left in modernity or in the ancient world, and they're trying to figure out what their ancestors believed, what their wisdom was for living life. And they'd all be bickering with each other because they had fragments of things. They may all have fragments from one source, like Plato, but they have it from different sources, and it seems to contradict because they don't have the whole argument. So now they're fighting with each other. They're fighting with each other about biology, chemistry, philosophy, everything you can think of. There's literally no point of conversation, no common ground. And he says that analogy is actually not so much post-apocalyptic, but it's actually now. In a postmodern world, there's little to no ground. And one of the key problems there is that people don't understand. He goes later in the book to describe that people don't understand the history of philosophy, that philosophy and that ethics and all these different things are done in time and space. Right. And they interact with each other, and they're not necessarily a war of ideas exclusively, but there is that element. That's history right. is important. That's right. So can you expound on that a little bit more and how a Christian should go about studying the history of philosophy?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that makes the history of philosophy so important to study is that it is if you start to grasp even like the smallest part of the totality of the history of philosophy, you are instantly put in like a mirror of your own finitude, right? You see yourself in the mirror and you are face to face with your own finitude, right? Because the theories are so lofty. The contradictions sometimes are so vast and important. Yep. The development is so amazing and so interesting to watch. And you'll become humbled. The more philosophy you read, I really believe that the more philosophy you read, the more you should become humbled. Now, some people this doesn't work that way, but in theory, right, when you're presented with seemingly rational disparities, you should come to the conclusion that, what you thought was so certain really isn't that certain, right?
Especially in Christian philosophy.
And so I would say it's important for Christians to study the history of philosophy, one, so they're well-versed and can participate in that conversation politically, like you're talking about, but also simply so that they can recognize their own finitude before God and their fellow man, right? Socrates was willing to go into the marketplace, and though he had a level of arrogance about him when he was teasing people, he also had a level of humility because he was always looking at someone like they may teach him something.
Socratic wisdom. I know nothing.
I know nothing except that I know nothing, right?
Exactly.
Obvious contradiction, but it's funny, right? And it's like it's his way of getting at the fact that he's finite. And so this is one of the key points of philosophy. Another reason to study the history of philosophy is simply to, you hinted at it there, a kind of conservatism, right? Truth isn't always found just in the reasoning mind, like Rene Descartes said. It's also found in a history of people whom you're building upon the backs of, right? And it's found in these institutions and these people that you're reading, right? So, one of the glories of humanism, for all the things that it was bad about, right, is going back to the sources, right?
Ad fontes.
And ad fontes, going back to the sources. And so I would say studying the history of philosophy is, one, necessary to gain knowledge of philosophy so you know what you're talking about, and so you can participate in the conversation, you can build. Two, it's so that you can, in that and following from that, it's so that you can be informed about certain debates and certain arguments that have been had before you. You're probably not coming up with something revolutionary in your room. If you're doing armchair philosophy, it's probably been discussed before in the history of philosophy. And third, so that you can humble yourself before a tradition of men, an entire tradition of men who have been doing the same thing, and who, the best of them, would say, dare to know, right? They would say dare to know, and they would say let me help you dare to know.
I think, speaking from a more ecclesiological perspective, Christians just study philosophy because philosophy impacts church. And to assume that it doesn't, quite frankly, just shows how much they've been impacted by it, by the uncritical spirit of our time.
That's right.
The fact that they're unwilling to even consider that proposition just proves my point.
Right, and you're talking about the evangelical church and the emphasis on doing, not on thinking, right? Reflection.
Yeah.
There's already an acceptance of a philosophy, right?
Well,
He study philosophy.
Yeah, he doesn't disparage that unquestioning spirit.
American pragmatism.
Yeah, it's exactly American pragmatism. And so Paul says to be aware of vain philosophies and not to get carried away by them.
That's right.
He doesn't say don't get carried away by philosophy.
Right. Or to study philosophy.
Yeah, he doesn't disparage philosophy itself. He
Right.
disparages vain philosophy.
That's right.
And vain philosophies, plural. So what are we thinking about? Let's think here for a second. What is the one or the couple philosophical schools that Paul interacts with that we explicitly know about? Epicureanism and Stoicism and Gnosticism. That's not to say that we can't gain something from those, but it is to say that on the deception, you would be able to, yeah, it is a vain philosophy, which we can't follow as Christians. And in my opinion, as human beings, you would never know that if you didn't know what Epicureanism was.
Right.
You would be ignorant and susceptible to deception. You would be able to be deceived and then live your whole life as a lie. Is that really what we're supposed to be doing? No, it's absolutely not. Those who present people with truth.
You see that throughout our culture, actually, raising its ugly head all the time. The famous pop reference "YOLO" is a great embodiment of that philosophy.
Those who present people with truth.
You see that throughout our culture, actually, raising its ugly head all the time. The famous pop reference "YOLO" is a great embodiment of that philosophy. But if you don't get that has already manifested itself, if you don't look throughout history, basically what you're doing is you're just not looking at history to learn from it, and it's unbiblical. Because Ecclesiastes is all, at least the beginning, is all centered around, in fact, the whole book is all centered around that there is nothing new under the sun.
That's right.
And it is foolish to think otherwise.
That's right.
So that, I think, from a biblical perspective, just proves the importance of the history of philosophy.
Well, and what does Ecclesiastes tell us? It says vanity of vanities, all is vanity, but then it presents what as the cure to vanity?
In Christian philosophy.
Wisdom.
Christ, ultimately.
Yeah.
Ultimately Christ. But there's a level in which philosophy may, because Christ was a human being and therefore did philosophy, participate in that.
And was philosophy come down?
The
Logos, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
We'll get in Christian philosophy.
Logos and hermeneutics, looking at the Old Testament in the wisdom literature where wisdom is constantly embodied or personalized, they point to that as being Christ himself.
And logos is a word that's used in Stoic philosophy, referring to that which makes intelligible all reality. Yeah. And then it's embodied in a person in John 1. So to say, that the Christians did not synthesize, get the meat and throw out the bones with the philosophies of the day is just asinine, right?
Yeah.
And in America, I think it expresses itself in something that we're all very familiar with, being evangelicals or post-evangelicals who adhere to the authority of Scripture, and that's that fundamentalism, fundamentally, was separatistic. It viewed the bad as being in the thing, not in the appropriation of the bad things in the thing, right? Fundamentalism, as you know, they say, like, separate yourself from alcohol because alcohol is inherently bad. Well, they did the same thing with philosophy. Separate yourself from all forms of philosophy because philosophy is inherently bad.
Which took the form of biblicism.
You can't read Nietzsche. If you don't know the philosophies that come in contradiction to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, then you can't destroy them and subject them to him. The Scriptures itself will sin. If you don't know the philosophy of Colossians 2, then you can't reject the vain philosophy of Colossians 2. If you don't know the philosophies that come in contradiction to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, then you can't destroy them and subject them to him. The Scriptures itself will synthesize and, in one sense, Christianize ideas that make clear and explicate Christian truth, like the Logos, or like Paul when he gets into, he's in Acts 17, and he meets the people at the Areopagus on their own ground, right? When he's presenting the gospel, he says, in their own literature, a philosophy comes out, it talks about the unknown God, and he moves from their true knowledge of the unknown God to the God of the Scriptures and Christian philosophy. And so to throw out philosophy is basically just to throw out, you can't be a consistent biblicist. That's where that philosophy breaks down, right? If the Bible itself contains an appropriation of philosophy and is itself not biblicistic, neither can you be a consistent biblicist.
Well, how does that work for the apostles?
Right.
And
they didn't do it.
For the early evangelists and disciples, I mean, for them, the Scriptures, the Bible, was the Old Testament.
Right.
Yet here they are. They're writing new documents, and the church accept those documents as being the very word of God, as being part of that canon.
That's right.
So that's what distinguishes us, in fact, from the Jews that hold fast to being against the Messiah and just want to keep the shadow of the thing, but not the substance.
That's right. They were in the cave.
Yeah,
They weren't willing to. They weren't willing to be open to being a reality.
Exactly.
That's a good point, man. Yeah. So Christianity is anti-biblicistic at its very foundations, right?
Yeah.
It's sola scriptura, is not biblicism, right?
Yeah.
The adherence that let's make that point because it's a good point.
Yeah.
The belief that the Bible is the highest authority and the most universal authority to the church, right, is not the same thing as the belief that there can't be relative or subordinate authorities to that in tradition or in philosophy or in anybody really because of God's common grace. You can learn from anything, and you should learn from everything.
Yeah.
And you know, it's fundamentally a Gnostic philosophy too. Like the Bible comes in from like heaven, and it's just like the Bible is just instantiated from heaven as a series of propositions, right? No, the Bible was written by men who lived in contexts, who engaged with their context and lived in a world. It is inherently it's an earthy book in one sense, right?
Yeah.
It comes from heaven and it comes from the earth because men wrote it, but they wrote it according to the inspiration of God.
All right, so lightning round.
Lightning
you
round.
Ready?
All right.
All right. So
Mike's gonna give his number one, then I'll give my number one. Then we'll just argue about it for 10 seconds.
No, mine's better.
10 seconds only. No. All right. So who would you guys say are the top 10 important figures
You want to go
in
chronologically?
the history of philosophy?
I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Aristotle.
So I would say my first one would be the Plato-Socrates synthesis in Plato's writings. So you get Socrates and Plato both in the Republic. And reason being, Socrates embodies the philosophic spirit, and Plato engages in some of the most important questions that all of philosophy from then engage in, in the Republic. All right, your two. Who's your two?
Augustine.
My second one would be Aristotle, right? And I think Mike and I would agree. Aristotle demythologizes Plato to a degree, instantiates the forms, and gives reason to do some science in the game, right? So philosophy takes upon itself natural philosophy. You know, I want to say why I love Aristotle so much is that he embodies the classical spirit of viewing all of knowledge as one uniform body. And I think that people should hold to that as an ideal, including the human being in that. So you said Augustine, second.
After Augustine, I would go with Aquinas.
Thomas, okay. You know what? I'm gonna go with Augustine third too. You know, I'm gonna put Augustine there. So
This is going to be the same.
Augustine. Well, yeah, I mean we have a little bit of differentiation on priority, but Augustine, you know, embodies historically, crassly, people say synthesizes Platonic philosophy with Christian philosophy, but he really, you know, he delves into a lot of Christian philosophy and really starts the philosophy of the Reformed tradition in one sense, right?
Yeah.
Not starts it, but embodies it, like conceptualizes it. So I think it's important for us as the Reformed philosopher. 4.
I'm going to jump a bit, and not necessarily for constructive use would I have everyone read this person, but I would have them read him because you can't really understand our contemporary time without him, and that's Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Okay. So why Nietzsche?
Because we've inherited a Nietzschean society.
Right. And his main idea being like nihilism and
Nihilism, will to power,
Will to power.
cultural relativism, transcendence of good and evil, the idea of
God is dead.
that, atheism, and then also his Übermensch.
Ubermensch.
The idea of transcending human
Jordan Peterson.
weakness in favor of human power. And that fits very well with pragmatism. You can take Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch and toss in with a pragmatic context, and boom, you'd actually have it happen.
Right. So just to make clear that point, like Nietzsche was the philosopher who famously did not create but proclaimed that God is dead according to the modern tilt, right?
The madman.
The madman, right? And so we'll probably have later episodes on Nietzsche, but it's good to note that that's who's saying that. And then he espouses a philosophy that there is no truth, there is no values, which is part and parcel of modern day. So I'm on my 4th.
Yeah.
So I'm after Augustine. Boethius. Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius was one of the most influential books on me and is the precursor to Thomas, and he is dealing with one of the biggest problems of philosophy and one of the biggest practical problems of how reason and how philosophy can console you in times of suffering and sorrow. And so I think he's extremely important there. Your 5th. Kierkegaard. Okay, all right. We're going to have a similarity there. Kierkegaard, do you have a reason why?
My point with the reading of these top 10 philosophers is to give the person reading them an understanding of some of the breadth of the history of philosophy. So it's not all necessarily for constructive use. But I think it would be arrogant and foolish and against philosophical disposition and spirit to assume that I can't learn something from every philosopher.
That's right.
So I would pick Kierkegaard because of his emphasis upon despair and his moral assent. I find to be very helpful. He is also the father of existentialism.
Right.
So it's an introduction to a broader area which you can further study on your own.
That's
I think he is someone that everyone should read.
That's right.
At some point.
Yeah, I would say, if you're going to study the history of philosophy, you have to study Kierkegaard because, the self.
He's there.
Yeah.
So what am I on mine? 6?
You're on
5.
Same
Thomas Aquinas, right? So Thomas Aquinas is the meta mind of the who synthesizes, again, crassly, the Aristotelian tradition of empiricism and the and a metaphysic in Christian philosophy. And I love Thomas's metaphysic, and that's primarily what I want people to read and to be acquainted with is the what I would say is the absolute rationality and clear division of Thomas's metaphysic is something that should not be ignored. His definition of metaphysics and the clarity abstractly in which he communicates. I think Thomas is actually hard to read if you're not privy to the language that he's using.
He is very difficult.
Right, he's difficult to read. But once you start to understand the language, you realize that the precision at which he's talking
is absurd.
Is absolutely absurd. So just to give one
Insane.
distinction of Thomas, right? He distinguishes between physics, math, and metaphysics in a way that I think is so interesting, right? So I think the modus of his distinction is the tiedness of the subject to matter, right? To the stuff that we feel. And he says physics is, which is just the study of bodies in motion, right, is distinct from the other two disciplines in that it is dependent upon matter both at its inception to start as a science and for its furtherance. You have to keep on testing stuff, right? Mathematics is one level higher mentally because it's necessary for matter to start, but it's not necessary for matter to finish, right? In order to have math, you have to have the concept of quantity and see 2 + 2 = 4. So there's 2 cups together with 2 other cups equals 4 cups. But after you get that initial step, it's all in the brain. Like it's all just a brain exercise. But the metaphysics he defines as that which is not dependent upon matter for its inception, nor for its furtherance. Now, the way in which he gets into that is he says that you do learn metaphysics by sense perception and moving up from perceiving things, but in and of itself, once you get there, it's not dependent because God does metaphysics, right? God is not dependent upon matter for himself or for its furtherance. And so Thomas is just a beast, all right? Like that's the thing. He really exemplifies the Christian form of the Aristotelian ethic of knowledge being a perfection, something to pursue for its own sake. So I didn't mean to go so long on it, but you gotta love Tommy.
Hey, it's Thomas.
It's
you
Tommy.
can go all day on
Big Tommy A. And Mike loves Thomas, so I'm kind of just patting his head. He's a Thomas through and through. I'm just sympathetic.
Yeah.
Number 6.
After Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. You guys have no idea how difficult this is. This is not fair to be sprung upon like this. I cry injustice.
It's good though.
Okay, I'm going to jump out of chronological order, starting now. Well, actually, no, not starting now, but I will be in the next one. I think because of the proliferation of technology and technological advancement and the ethical conundrums and also metaphysical conundrums that presents us, that we need to study the philosophy behind technology, the ethics of technology. Introduction to that, I think I would want to introduce Hannah Arendt.
Hannah Arendt?
And her book, The Human Condition. I think her understanding of modern science is tearing the bonds of nature.
I love Hannah Arendt.
And things of that nature. I think that's a very helpful way, and I think her analysis of science not being itself utterly independent and being self-sufficient, I think her saying, no, science needs other things, her balance view there, and also her emphasis upon man as a political animal,
right?
I think is very helpful. Her phenomenological emphases also could kind of get you into phenomenology if you wanted to study that a little bit more. So I think she would be someone that you should look at.
Yeah, even if she's not in my top 10, I will definitely say Hannah Arendt is one of my favorite philosophers that I've recently discovered, right? Technology, totalitarianism, right? The human condition, right? All those things are good. Okay, so I'm on my 6th after Thomas.
Yeah.
So so I'm gonna cheat a little bit and use 2, and it's because I love them both, but I'm going to use John Calvin and Francis Turretin as 1.
Yeah.
All right. So
that's not fair.
So you can do it if they're really tied. You can do it. I did Socrates and Plato and John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
John Calvin rightly is primarily considered a theologian, exegete, a bibliophile, right? All those things. A humanist who's going back to the sources. The reason I include him here is because he does something that is inherently philosophical, right? If you remember, he's asking philosophical questions in his institutes. If you remember his question, what comes first, knowledge of God or knowledge of man, right? And he says, I don't know.
And what does right wisdom consist?
Right, does wisdom consist? These are inherently philosophical questions that are given a Protestant and Reformed answer, right? And so I think that Calvin is necessary for the Reformed philosopher to be acquainted with so that he can distinguish his own philosophy as a philosophy. And the man who does this, in my opinion, the best of bringing the philosophic spirit, particularly the Aristotelian spirit, to Calvin's overall theology is Francis Turretin, right? So he's a scholastic, and he is the the foremost proponent, the biggest name in Reformed scholasticism, which is something that's big in the Reformed philosopher, right? We have the Reformed scholastic right here in front of me, and it's a tradition that we much love. So, yeah.
Number 7.
I'm going to jump out of historical continuity as right now. Peter Martyr Vermigli.
Peter Martyr Vermigli.
He is historically considered to be the Reformed Thomist.
Ooh.
He has an excellent commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics.
Gotcha.
And many, many other works. From what I've read of him, which isn't a ton, but I've read enough to kind of get the gist of what he's doing, and I've read enough historiography on him to be like, dang, I think he's very helpful for Protestants interested in Thomism.
Yeah.
And also showing how he balances Thomas with his Protestant convictions.
Gotcha.
Turgeon's also useful for that, but
That's
I
right.
think Vermigli brings a much more explicitly philosophical
Gotcha.
spirit to it. And I think
Than
that's,
Turgeon even?
In some ways,
I mean,
yes, in
Turgeon's
some ways.
primarily he's primarily doing electic theology, which
Yeah,
is
whereas-
polemic theology. It's polemic. So.
Whereas Vermigli will be like, no, I'm just going to write a commentary.
He's constructing a positive philosophy
on Aristotle's Nicomachean because I can.
Yeah, I would say if that's the case, that's probably more important to read than Turgeon for a Christian philosopher. Then,
Yeah, absolutely.
If he's doing a constructive work, not just an electic work, it's good. Am I on 6 or 7?
7.
I know. I just know who I'm after. I know I'm after Calvin. Rene Descartes. All right, is my next most important. And the reason for this is not because there's a book you're reading right now. It's called Cosmopolitan, right?
Yes.
The book you're reading. And I think in that, I think I've read part of it. It argues that the precursor to modernity, Cosmopolis, right? And that the precursor to modernity is not just Rene Descartes, and that it actually happened before that. And I think that's a fundamentally true thesis. But I include Descartes because he is someone who embodies what we would call the modern tilt in philosophy, the modern term. So classical philosophers we're talking to up to this point highly emphasize metaphysics, highly emphasize the unity of our worldview, highly emphasize all these things. And Rene Descartes systematically doubts, right? That's the goal of his philosophy, is to doubt so that it can achieve bedrock certainty. In so doing, he abstracts himself from being in the world. He abstracts himself from being in a body. And he results into an anthropology that is nothing more certain than him as a thinking thing. And in this, he changes the entire course of philosophy in one sense, or embodies a change that was happening in the course of philosophy, which throws off Christian revelation as something which is necessary to do full and final Christian philosophy. Yeah. And so I think he's important in that regard.
All right, Mike, 8.
This is mean.
It is mean.
We only got 3 more. Come on.
I'm going to jump into the contemporary sphere and say Alistair MacIntyre. His emphasis upon Aristotelian ethics as a proposed solution to the conundrums of contemporary ethics and the contemporary ethical context of categorical disagreement and the inability to come to a rational terminus.
Right.
I think is very helpful. His interpretation of the history of moral philosophy is very helpful. And I think what is so helpful you instill the philosophical agreeing with him is he forces you to question the assumptions behind our contemporary time about what ethics is, what it pursues. So even if you don't disagree with him, he will help you instill the philosophical spirit of actually putting things to the question.
Right. Or I would say I've learned to love MacIntyre through you two primarily. So and everything you guys say about him, I'm like, yeah, man, yeah, so I'm after Descartes. I would say important to understand the American landscape particularly, and to understand the distinction from Descartes in the modern milieu is John Locke, right? So John Locke embodies an empiricist tradition which is distinct both from Rene Descartes and from Aristotle. So Aristotle says that knowledge begins in sense experience, but the main thing that the sense experience perceives is the forms, right? Which is just a substantive body, right? It's that I don't just perceive the red particular on the wall. I perceive the wall, and then I perceive the red particular within the wall, right? It always moves from broader to more particular. But Locke isn't like this. He rejects Descartes' doctrine of substantial forms, which is that you perceive cups and men and things like that, in favor of what we would call like a nominalist predication, which is we see particulars and then we give them a name. And so Locke distinguishes himself both from him and from Descartes as a modernist who rejects Christian revelation. Or he doesn't reject Christian revelation, but he has to move there through reason, right? It's not that he justifies Christian revelation primarily, or justifies reason primarily through Christian revelation.
Yeah. Number 9, last 2.
Last 2. This is really hard. I think for any person living in our contemporary time will at some point have to both personally and intellectually struggle. In some ways, the only rational option left, nihilism. Because there's an extent to which we are inescapably a product of our own times, however much we may hate that. And nihilism is, in many ways, in some ways, the only rational option left. On the assumption that everything that came before us, all the critiques were true. If we're to take that view, which basically we do, life isn't allowed to have any more meaning. And at some point, you're going to have to deal with that. And I would recommend, I already mentioned, he says, and he wants us to live in defiance against the absurdity. I think someone else trajectory that people should read is Albert Camus. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Right. He says, and he wants us to live in defiance against the absurdity of life. Now, I want people to read that. One, to realize that nihilism actually isn't an option. Because if you read Camus, it's not satisfying.
Right.
Because his revolt against the absurd, it's nothing more than a defiant defeat.
That's right.
It can't give you a project to live.
Or happiness.
No,
Right.
it can't.
Right.
It can give you a lot of depression and a lot of really, crappy sleeping habits, but that's about it.
You know, it's funny, Mike. For one who is so seemingly skeptical of the existentialist tradition, you sure do seem to be talking about a lot of existentialists in your
I
history
live with two
philosophy.
existentialists, and I'm forced to consider it.
All right, so I'm on 9 now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kant. Okay, so Immanuel
Stole
Kant.
my last.
Immanuel Kant is famous for what he calls the Copernican revolution in philosophy, right?
Cheater.
And so what Kant does, and I mentioned Descartes and Locke before him because they're all dealing with this problem of knowledge and metaphysics. So Locke is presupposing a primacy of the external world in his metaphysic, but what Kant wants to do is to say, you can't have, he's traversing what's called the appearance reality distinction, the appearance reality problem. How does Aaron or Mike move from their appearance of things to knowing that they are actually perceiving the reality of things? And Kant's answer is essentially that there is a noumenal realm, a realm of data that is inaccessible to you, and that there is an impenetrable wall between you and it. And that what you actually perceive is just your sense perception in relation to that noumenal realm. And he calls this realm the phenomenological realm. And he says that the mind, the human mind, he centers intelligibility around the human mind, and he says that the mind is necessary actually to structure that experience at all. And that you learn of that realm, or you learn of the what is necessary to structure reality, and you learn of your own mind and how it works through experience, right? So he says that the mind is ultimately, this is how he synthesizes rationalism and empiricism, right? With rationalism, he assumes that the mind must be active in the creation of intelligibility, or the realization of intelligibility. But with the empiricist, he says that one only comes to real knowledge of what the mind is
My last one.
itself. And this is what he calls the synthetic a priori. So, and that's abstract, but we'll do more stuff on Kant later.
Number 9?
10. Or you said 10.
Yeah, sorry, 10, last one.
10, my last one. Oh, man. This is so unfair of you.
We should have like 15.
We should have just done 125 list. I can't even pick. This is...
About Rand.
Yeah, I mean, you could go with Rand if you wanted to. If you wanted to study capitalism, and egoism, the way it's produced itself in contemporary American society, on Rand would be a good choice. But it's quite dark, and it can get quite dark quite quickly. And I don't want to end on a dark note because, despite how depressing,
Come on, you love the color black. You wanna
I
paint
do
the
love
whole
the
world
color
in-
black, but I have a secret
see a
spot
red door
that I
and you-
like.
You see a red door and you want to paint it black.
Dun, 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 dun. You know what? Epictetus.
Epictetus?
Yes.
Who
He is
the
a
heck is that?
Stoic philosopher. He's fantastic.
You went way back, buddy.
Yeah, I went all the way back to the beginning. Gotta go back to the
broke all
beginning.
the rules
Why do you
here.
like him?
I like him because of his emphasis upon virtue,
Virtue.
his emphasis upon God, actually,
Mm-hmm.
or his conception of God, at least. If you were to go through this process of reading, and you would start with Aristotle. You would go to Augustine, and then Aquinas. And the very next thing you read is Nietzsche.
Right.
And the very next thing you read is Hannah Arendt. Oh no! What was it?
After Nietzsche.
Nietzsche was then Kierkegaard,
Right.
and then Hannah Arendt, and then
For you.
yes,
back
for me.
to
and then it was Camus.
Right.
So I would just have basically given you a really big dose of atheism, doubt,
sadness.
lots of depression. Epictetus is a very clear rhetorical writer with substance.
There you go.
He will present you with, no, you need to live. And you need to live rightly. So quit sitting around like a little wimp and live.
There you go.
He can be a little forceful at times, but I think his emphasis upon virtue and the way we ought to live and the way truth ought to be pursued and wisdom ought to be pursued is very helpful. Now, granted, you get all that from Thomas.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Probably in a better way, too.
And in my opinion, yeah, in a better and more systematic way, but also my secondary motivation is that it would also introduce you to Stoicism, which would allow you to read others.
There you go. And
Another one on that though too is Cicero.
Cicero.
Right.
Yeah, I love
According to
Cicero.
Ryan.
Cicero's
My
another
wife
good
loves
option.
Cicero. So she's in the room with us right now. So
Cicero's
good to see her.
awesome.
My 10th, Ludwig Wittgenstein.
There you go.
The reason I choose Wittgenstein is because he embodies an entire trajectory in philosophy, which I think is actually an interesting trajectory. It's the linguistic turn in philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So we
Analytics.
talked about how the classic view is primarily metaphysical and unified worldview.
Mm-hmm.
The modern tilt is epistemological, and then the linguistic turn is it has to do with language. And Wittgenstein does a good job of calling out the BS of two of his former guys, Frege and Russell.
Yep.
Russell and Frege were both two arrogant men, and Wittgenstein kind of says, you know what, language is way that view.
Yeah.
And what I would say is a more rational view of language, right?
Yeah.
A more Russell want to do, and he has like what's called a pictorial theory of language, right? And that language is dictated presents
Early on, yeah.
early on, but then he critiques that view.
Yeah.
And what I would say is a more rational view of language, right?
Yeah.
A more in accordance with reality, where he says that language is a series of games that are meant to be played, right? And that language is dictated primarily by use, right? So so if I say red means dog and red ran across the road, you knew what I meant, right? Yeah. Because you can play a game, you can control words, and words are developing, and so. If you put Wittgenstein next to Noam Chomsky, I think you're getting towards a good view of language. But I put him there primarily not to say like you should accept everything that he says critically, not with any of these guys actually, but because he embodies the linguistic turn in philosophy. I think.
Yeah.
Foremostly and brilliantly, really. I mean, he was a brilliant mind.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Once again, thank you for joining us here on the Growing Philosopher podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Lague. As usual, if you would like to take a look at some of the works from the philosophers discussed in this podcast, you can find them below in the podcast description if you go to our website at www.philosopher. A discussion specifically on philosophy in the Christian life. Philosopher.